During World War I, armies arrayed against each other in extremely long and complex trenches. These trenches were each a fortress, as a single man and a gatling gun could take on hundreds of advancing infantry with almost no risk to himself. Such an image of attackers having to surmount the near impossible to take a position is evocative of castle warfare from centuries before. It could also be described as positional warfare, or warfare where two sides are fighting for a specific position. In war, the defender always possesses the advantage in a fortified position, especially if the number of forces on both sides is symmetrical. Eventually, however, tanks were invented which allowed attackers to bypass some defenses if reliable enough, and take positions that were previously nearly impossible to take. This seemingly ingenious invention of war was essentially a motorized siege machine. It was also a siege machine that had artillery capabilities, something unheard of to medieval armies. This massive upgrade of siege machines, or tanks as we now know them, allowed for attackers to break through defenses with leagues more success than ever before. To be clear, this doesn't mean that giving an army a dozen tanks automatically gives them guaranteed victory. Superior numbers of forces are still required to guarantee success. Now, over 100 years later, tanks are still siege machines. They are still used in urban combat scenarios. Main battle tanks are simply the latest evolutions of the land ships of World War I. They have greater speed in both directions, greater mobility, more firepower, more accuracy, and most importantly, greater protection. It would be foolish, therefore, to assume that because tanks have performed so well in open battlefields, they should not be used in cities. Cities are essentially one massive fortress for the defenders, or an assortment of fortresses that are interconnected. Just as tanks were originally created to break through the World War I strongholds comprised of trenches, they should be used today to punch through and conquer the fortresses of today that are cities. There are some caveats to this, as there were caveats to World War I tank usage. Are tanks the only solution to quasi-guerrilla fighters in cities? Obviously not. Just as the land ships required infantry accompanying them, modern tanks need infantry support or even direction. Otherwise, tanks can be surrounded and shot at through weak points or blind spots with impunity by the enemy. Tanks may sometimes take a secondary role. They are still extremely useful for punching holes in enemy fortifications. Tanks can use a variety of munitions and their large mass to fire different forms of artillery or demolish buildings by ramming them. Imagine a battering ram that can carry men, protect them, and fire projectiles. This is the dream weapon for assaulting an urban environment. Now, to illustrate this, we need some examples of how this has played out in real warfare. In the Second Battle of Fallujah in Iraq, US tanks helped support the infantry forces taking the city by providing artillery support. They also did a great job at securing positions and acting as intimidating presences towards the insurgents. Any psychological advantage that comes from a main battle tank's presence is highly welcome in an already terrifying and tense environment. This goes both ways as well. As the Marines attacked the city, every single house was a possible location to be fired at from. Every house was a possible enemy fortress to be taken. In these sorts of situations, it is advantageous for the attacking force to have some sort of fortress of their own that they can have full confidence in. That fortress is obviously a tank. The Marines attacking the city could be sure of no building safety, not even the buildings they had already been through, and their only sure sense of support could come from their allied tanks. Even from just a morale perspective, if the soldiers had gone into the city with no support from tanks at all, it would just have been them, the infantry, in a vast city of enemies. That is not exactly a good recipe for an attacking force's confidence and bravery, which is essential for continued success and vigilance. That said, I have nothing but respect for the Marines and Western forces who went into that combat zone. This just reminds us that urban combat is horrible and brutal. However, if tanks can make it any less so for an attacking force, then they should certainly be used to do so. Another example of tanks performing well in urban combat is just their general survivability uses against insurgents. Main battle tanks can effectively protect soldiers from IEDs while offering good mobility, off-road capability, and firepower. There are certain situations in urban combat where that can be highly useful. A classic example of how tanks improved the situation in urban warfare for the US was the improvement in success from the battles of Mogadishu in 1993 to the Battle for Baghdad in 2003. The US forces in Somalia in 1993 did not have a respectable amount of tank support, and this meant that towards the latter part, some US forces had to rely on Pakistani tanks to rescue them from the enemy. Obviously, more US armor on the ground would have been desirable for a better result of the US operation. In contrast, the Western coalition attack on Baghdad in 2003 went quite differently and resulted in a quick victory for the US and its allies because the US had such profound armored supremacy. The Iraqi forces' quick and major defeat was largely because the US and its allies had heavy armored support that allowed them to figuratively steamroll opposition. As a final example of how main battle tanks are good in urban combat scenarios, I will briefly reference the Battle of Hue City in 1968, when American forces fighting in a Vietnam city lost their most valuable asset, their air support. Poor visibility and weather conditions prevented the US Air Force from providing the level of support to soldiers on the ground that they would have liked to provide. In a situation like this, the importance of heavy armor on the ground in the form of main battle tanks is emphasized. Heavy armor can provide, in albeit lesser levels, the intimidation and firepower that air attacks can pose to entrenched enemy forces. This is an advantage no army should refuse in an urban combat scenario when so many benefits are on the entrenched opponent's side. In conclusion, main battle tanks are not terrible in urban combat. They are sometimes even necessary to achieve victory. Battle after battle has proven their reliability in being powerful machines capable of improving the results of combat for their side. A country would be foolish to withhold their armored forces from combat in a city just because those armored forces can't maneuver as well or fire as far. Urban combat is on the rise, and the sides that choose to utilize armor in their military makeup will see greater success. Finally, I would like to rant about how video games choose to debuff tanks in cities. Why would the game designers make tanks weaker in cities, and in doing so create a game that does not represent reality? Do they just have an animus towards tanks? I suppose it's possible. If they didn't do this, RTS games such as Conflict of Nations would surely see greater use of tanks. Perhaps that is the reason why. Those games would be too boring if they represented the fact that tanks can be useful in most any combat scenario, and that would lead to a meta of all tanks. Alright, rant over. Let me know what you guys thought of this video in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and have a nice day.